Just 2 days ago, we had the privilege of hearing the Palestinian perspective of things. Today, we will be hearing the Jewish one. We are joined by Mr. Alex Ryvchin, the co-CEO of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry. He's joined us today to discuss the Jewish perspective of this war, as well as where he sees it heading in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Joseph Najjar with Oz Arab Media, and I'd like to welcome you today to this special interview. I would like to tell people that you are allowed to ask questions throughout this interview in the comments section. I just ask that they please remain respectful. Without further ado, it's time for us to get into it. Mr. Ryvchin, thanks for joining us. How are you?
Great pleasure. I'm very well. Thank you for having me.
We're glad to have you. I'm going to start off by discussing the Gaza hospital attack just a few days ago. The statement put out by Israeli officials blamed it on the Islamic Jihad. Do you support this statement?
Look, I'm not in a position to independently verify what happened, but I know who I trust and who I don't trust. I certainly don't trust Hamas to accurately describe what happened. Looking at all the evidence that's been presented in the media, at the reports prepared by the US administration that have been made public, it looks by all accounts, all credible accounts, based on the nature of the explosion, the site, an inspection of the site, the damage that was caused and so forth, that it was a rocket rather than an Israeli missile strike. Look, when you've got terrorist organizations from there shooting rocket volleys wantonly, unguided missiles with the aim of causing maximum havoc and civilian harm, it's inevitable that this thing's going to happen. And it's happened in the past and it's going to happen again. And when you have also these terrorist forces firing deliberately from built up residential areas, knowing that Israel won't wantonly strike at them, again, civilian casualties will happen. It's a great tragedy. And the Palestinian people, by my view, are the great sufferers, the greatest sufferers from Hamas and Islamic Jihad. And that's why I hope for them to be destroyed in their entirety. I want the Palestinian people to live in peace. They have every right for that. But as long as they're ruled over by a terrorist organization, it's impossible.
Yeah. Well, I asked you for your perspective regarding the attack on the hospital because the Israeli officials initially took credit for the attack, saying it was a military attack and they hit a military target, until only afterwards they realized when it was civilians. They deleted those tweets. So I was wondering what the consensus was perhaps in the Australian Jewish community regarding that.
I mean, we don't have a separate position on it. So we have no insight into Israeli military operations and things like that. So we, much like you, respond to what's put out in the media, what's put out on social media by spokespeople, by media agencies and various parties who are seeking to investigate and get to the bottom of it. But I think that over the last few days, it's become pretty clear as to what happened. And that's not an Israeli defense perspective. I think that's based on what impartial governments and various observers have noted.
Okay. Are you concerned at all by the actions perhaps by the Israeli government and just recently the US and the United Nations regarding the deliverance of humanitarian aid to those stuck in the Gaza, because it has been very scarce?
Yeah, well, look, again, I'm following the reports like you are in terms of what's happening. I understand that the Rafah crossing into Egypt was briefly made available, and I understand also that the Egyptians then closed it. Obviously, humanitarian supplies should flow to the extent that that's possible. But look, I think we need to understand that humanitarian aid is obviously a critical thing so that civilian suffering is minimized. But if we're concerned long term for Palestinian civilians, as we should all be, the only thing that can give them a better life, a life free from perennial war and conflict and destruction, is to live peacefully and not be ruled over by terrorist regimes. You can't have a situation where you have millions of people ruled over by a brutal Islamist regime that is intent, that sole purpose for existing is to wage war. They want war and they get war, and the people suffer for it. And Hamas and Islamic Jihad don't care in the least. For them, Palestinian civilian casualties feed into their propaganda war. So I hope in the short term that humanitarian corridors are made available. I hope that the Israelis keep doing what they're doing, which is giving notice of where they're going to strike and allowing time for civilians to flee those areas. I hope Hamas will begin to allow people to flee the war zones. But long term, there has to be a more binding solution. That solution begins with the defeat of Hamas.
If I could ask, what do you believe is the greatest way to achieve peace? Because for many Palestinians, they do see um, Hamas as a group that they feel they could use to target Israeli mistreatment. So, from your point of view, what is the greatest way to achieve this said peace?
Look, I agree with your proposition. I think probably, based also on polling data, there is a great deal of support for Hamas amongst the Palestinian population. They were voted in, and even in polls done in the West Bank, Hamas tends to be more popular than Fatah, than the more moderate Fatah. And I think it's a shame that the people think that Hamas will bring them anything other than destruction. And look at the evidence. I mean, Hamas has, through the Second Intifada from 2001 to 2005, they killed hundreds and hundreds of Israeli civilians, which for the sadists and those who like seeing civilian blood may strike them as some sort of a victory. But more Palestinians died and suffered as well. With all of these skirmishes and wars that Hamas imposes and inflicts, again, they might view it as a temporary victory of some sort, but in the end, the Palestinian people suffer more than anyone. So I think the Palestinian people need to see what their path to peace is. And that is to accept that Israel is permanent. It's not going anywhere. It's a just and organic part of the Middle East. The Jews have been there for thousands of years and they're not leaving. And to understand that they have a right to live in peace as well. But that can only come by recognizing the rights of the Jewish people. And if you ask for my vision for peace, for the future, for the region, it's a two-state solution. I've always supported that. I think that the Palestinians are a people, and just like my people have a right to live in peace and dignity. But they have been horribly misled by their leaders for decades, before even the creation of the State of Israel. They have been told that the Jews are their enemy, that there can never be any long-term peace and survival and existence with Jews around them. The minute they can overcome that and actually look towards a future of prosperity, of building something rather than destroying, then they'll have peace.
We just did get a comment right now from someone, and the comment is, why do you believe Israel was refusing aid to cross to the Gaza?
Look, I'm not sure of these details, I have to say. There are so many accounts coming in minute by minute of humanitarian aid flowing in, of corridors being opened up and then closed. I know that in the past there have been concerns raised that when humanitarian aid has come in, when civilian building supplies have been allowed in, they've been repurposed by Hamas for military means. So perhaps that's a concern. Maybe they think it'll interfere with their imminent military operation. These are the only reasons I can think of. What I do know from my experience of dealing with Israelis and the Israeli military establishment, they have no interest at all at a strategic, at a military, or at a human level of making the Palestinian people suffer. They don't want that. They don't need that. They want to protect themselves from the sort of barbarism that we saw 10 days ago. They want that. They want to destroy Hamas in its entirety because they realize there's no coexistence with them. But making Palestinian women and children and the elderly and civilians suffer, no one gains from that. No one wants that. So if you want to know why these things are happening with humanitarian corridors and closing and opening, I think it comes down to operational reasons. But I think there's also a great onus on the Arab world. They're very quick to express tokenistic solidarity with the Palestinian people. But I think they need to do more to avert a humanitarian crisis by allowing aid in, by allowing civilians to temporarily shelter in their countries. I think that these things will be very useful at this time.
We do have another comment. When you say the two-state solution, which border is it based on?
Look, if you gave me a map, I would draw what I think is a tenable and just border, and someone else would draw it slightly differently. In my view, it's never been about how we, mark the line on a map. I don't think that's what it's about. If that's what it was about, it would have been solved. When Israel made peace with the Egyptians in 78, 79, they at the last minute gave up, parts of territory which were allotted originally to them. The Jews have always been willing to accept less. In 37, when the Peel plan was put to them, it gave them a minuscule state and they were willing to accept it. In 47, again, a smaller state than they have now, and they were willing to accept it. So I don't believe that a line here or a line there is going to be the barrier to peace. The barrier to peace is extremism, absolutism, fanaticism, and a belief that one side has no rights and no legitimacy. If one views this as an anti-colonial struggle, that the Jews are a foreign implant who have stolen the land, then naturally one will fight them until they believe they can be defeated. And that's unfortunately where we are at the moment. But once the Palestinians realize that the Jews are not colonizers, they're home and in their own land, in the only land in which they've had self-determination, in the land in which they've lived for 3,000 years ago with the capital in Jerusalem, once these realizations are made, then the drawing of a line on a map isn't a big deal. It's not the problem.
Yeah, I agree with you. So, to those who are watching who may not know the complete history of the region, Jerusalem was founded by King David about 3,000 years ago, a very long time ago. But in regards to the Palestinians, for them, when they were the complete state, it was the British who promised a Jewish homeland to them in the region via the Balfour Declaration. So, from their point of view, they don't see it as perhaps maybe Jews being colonizers, but the fact that it was Western forces that colonized for them and as a result cost them their nation. Do you concur with that sentiment?
I don't. I concur with elements of it, and I'll tell you what I do agree with. But what I don't agree with is the framing of it, because there was never a Palestinian state. There was a loose region known as Palestine, which was so named by, comes from the Roman Emperor Hadrian from the year 135 CE, renaming Judea to Syria Palestina. It was never an autonomous state as we know a state to be. It was linked to Syria for long periods of time. It was part of the Ottoman Empire for 400 years. And in that land lived Arabs from the 7th century after the colonization of that land from the Arab Peninsula in the 7th century. Jews lived there for a long time. They were exiled by the Romans and came back in drips and drabs. So, you know, I think the view that there was a Palestinian state which was taken from them is patently false. What I do agree with, and what I think is absolutely true and undeniable, is that for hundreds and hundreds of years, Arabs have lived in that land. And for many, many people, that is the only land that they know to be their own. That is their home. And when after World War I, after the Ottoman Empire collapses, and the victorious allies, the US and the French and the Italians and the British start redrawing the map of the Middle East, people suffered. And things were drawn which led to the creation of states like Syria and Iraq and Transjordan, later Jordan, Saudi Arabia and the Kingdom of Hejaz and all these things. And we can talk about, you know, whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. But certainly I think for the Arab Palestinian people, they didn't wish to see a Jewish state in that land. But when you have the whole region being redrawn under the principle of decolonization and allowing the native peoples to take control of their own destiny, which was what the thinking behind it was, the Jews are one of those people and have every right to have their own autonomy. I wish it were done in a way that people weren't displaced. I wish it were done in a way that was peaceful. I wish that the Arab side were able to recognize the legitimacy of the Jews early on, and that war could have been averted in 1948 and beyond, and to this day. But I do sympathize with the Arabs, certainly. But I think that it was just for the Jews to have a state in the land. It wasn't merely something promised them by the British. The British in the Balfour Declaration said that they recognized the rights of the Jews to a homeland in Palestine as their historic homeland, at the same time as they recognized the right to an Arab state in Jordan and Egypt and Syria and Lebanon and all of these places. So I think it was legitimate.
I do have a couple comments I now want to read. To those who are watching, please feel free to leave your questions in the comment section. I'll start off with the first one. The agreement of Oslo 93 was based on the 1967 border. Is Israel happy to give back the whole West Bank to Palestine?
So the Oslo Accords didn't say anything about the 67 lines. It didn't prejudice what the final borders would be. In terms of what land should be given to the Palestinians, again, I think that's something to be agreed between the two parties. And when you look at the peace offers that were made in 2000, 2001, 2008, they basically included the entirety of Gaza, roughly 97, 98% of the West Bank, half of Jerusalem, and for the bits of the West Bank that were given to Israel to absorb the major settlement blocks, they were compensated with equal areas of land from Israel, mainly to connect Gaza to the West Bank. Again, it's not about that. It's not about that. If it were about the Palestinians having their own state, they would have accepted those offers. But it hasn't been about that. It's never been about that. So, you know, what the final borders will be, the parties, if they negotiate in good faith, they'll arrive at that. I'm not going to prescribe what I think that should be. I think we broadly know what that would look like. But it's more about recognizing the legitimacy of the other. That's what will inevitably bring peace.
Well, since 1993, apparently Israel has taken 58% of the West Bank, and obviously in recent years, perhaps most notably during the Obama years and the Trump years, there was an increasing construction of settlements in the West Bank. Do you see this as just or perhaps unfair to the Palestinians?
I don't agree with the characterization that they've taken land. I think that, you have had settlement blocks there for a long, long time. Some of them are more legitimate than others. When we talk about the settlement of Kiryat Arba near Hebron, Hebron is the second holiest city to the Jewish people. It's where the cave of the patriarchs is. It's where Jews lived for a long, long time until they were brutally murdered and ethnically cleansed from there in 1929. When you look at Gush Etzion, which is between Bethlehem and Jerusalem, same story, horrible violence drove the Jews from the land. So I think they have a right to go back to it. But at the same time, do I think that settlement construction is a good thing? Do I think it brings us closer to peace? Not particularly, I don't. But do I believe also that Israel should just hold on to the land in some sort of a trust situation, hoping that one day the Palestinians will say, yes, we recognize you, let's do business and let's arrive at a peace? I don't think that. I think building settlements creates an urgency which can actually help bring about peace. So ultimately, I think if tomorrow the Palestinians said, we're willing to negotiate on fair terms for a two-state solution, you would have negotiations. And I don't believe housing, apartments or roads or whatever infrastructure has been built is an obstacle to that.
Okay. I want to give you a example a Palestinian friend of mine once said regarding the two-state solution. We met studying politics in university, and when I asked him if the Palestinians would ever be interested, or if he thought the Palestinians would ever be interested in negotiating a two-state solution, he took a cup that had 2 ice cubes in it. He took out 1 ice cube and said, well, he gave me the glass. He said, now you have 2 ice cubes. Then he took out one of them and said, now we only have 1 ice cube. Do you think that's fair for us to lose half of what we already had? Do you concur with examples like that?
Look, I mean, it all depends on how one frames it. And I think the fact that he views Palestine, historic Palestine, as being his, and if you view it in those terms, and you view the Jews as being having no legitimate claim to the land, why would you negotiate? Why would you give anything away? I understand that completely. But the fact of the matter is that he's wrong in his characterization, because the Jews have deep and profound connections and roots in those lands. They have lived there for thousands of years. Just as Arab states were created post World War I, a Jewish state was envisaged and was ultimately created in 1948, which is legitimate. There was no sovereign Arab Palestinian state. There are many Arab states, I think 22 of them, but there was no independent Arab state. There's one Jewish state now. So it all depends on how one looks at it. But if one clings to that view as though there was an Arab state of Palestine which was taken from them, that's something that perpetuates conflict. That frames it as being wholly unjust. And why would one negotiate? They would resist, and through violence and whatever. That's why we are where we are. Too many people hold that view. If he came at it from the perspective of there are 2 peoples in the land, Jews and Arabs, each with their own history, vision for the future, each with their own rights, and we need to work out a fair accommodation, then you would have peace. But I think too few people come at it from that perspective.
Okay. I'd like to move on for a little bit now. I will just remind everybody who would like to ask a question to Mr. Ryvchin, to please just leave in the comment section. What has the Executive Council of Australian Jewry endorsed in regards to humanitarian aid to the Gaza? Has anything been sent on your behalf, or have you been in touch with people in the region regarding sending aid to people in the Gaza?
No, we've been in touch with, well, not my organization per se. We're not really a fundraising organization. We're an advocacy organization, a representative body of the Jewish community nationally. But I know some Jewish groups have been sending humanitarian aid to the orphans left by the slaughter of Hamas in southern Israel, people whose homes were burned to the ground, people who now have to pay for funerals and have no means to do that, people who have no clothing, have nothing at all. 1,400 people were slaughtered in their homes. 200 people are in captivity now. And the focus of the Jewish people and the Jewish world is on providing whatever support we can for them at this time. I understand governments, and particularly Arab governments in the Middle East, are providing aid for the Palestinians. I hope they get it. I sincerely do. And I hope it goes to the right places. And I hope that it's not hijacked by Hamas, as it tends to do. I hope that it helps people. And I hope that the civilian suffering on that side of the border is as minimal and short-term as possible.
Okay. In your eyes and the eyes of the Executive Council, how much has this conflict set back the peace process?
That's a good question. It's difficult to know. I mean, one of the things that's happened from this is that it's kind of brought everything to the surface, and it's kind of told us who our friends and enemies are, where people stand on this, where someone has to take a very clear moral position, things become a lot clearer. I think the cause of peace broadly between Jews and Arabs, between Israel and the Arab world, has been aided. My personal view, you might have a different insight on this, is that the majority of the Arab world is looking at what Hamas did in southern Israel with absolute horror. A lot of the Middle East has seen similar terrorist organizations unleash absolute havoc and barbarism in their own streets. So I think they will sympathize. So I think the long-term cause of peace between Israel and the Arab world has perhaps been enhanced. We've seen a lot of talk about the normalization deal with Saudi Arabia perhaps being set back. I don't think so. I think that the Saudis, in my view, are waiting for Israel to respond with due force to eradicate Hamas, and then I think they'll pursue normalization down the track. That's my view. In terms of peace between Israel and the Palestinians, I think also that a lot of Palestinians, I want to believe in my heart, looked at those scenes of rape and burning of children and people tortured, having their eyes gouged out and hands and feet cut off, and then hauled into captivity in horrific circumstances. I think a lot of ordinary Palestinians would look at that in shock. And I hope it will lead to a rejection of Hamas, the ascent of more moderate factions, which would then make peace more possible. That's my optimistic view of things.
Absolutely. We do have a couple comments coming in now. All right. So they had a comment. Somebody mentioned that Ehud Barak, the former Prime Minister of Israel, back in 2009, agreed to give back 96% of the West Bank to the Palestinians. Now, we both know that Prime Minister Barak was a very strong proponent of achieving peace in the region. Do you concur with the statement that he agreed to give back 96% of the West Bank?
In 2008, if I'm not mistaken, it was Olmert, not Barak. I think it was Barak.
Yeah, Barak was 1999 to 2001. I'm assuming that this individual was referring to the fact that perhaps he pushed as a civilian at the time.
So look, in 2008 offered basically what you've described. Barak in 2001 offered what you've described. As I said, since 2000, there have been 3 offers which are virtually identical. Everyone knows what it looks like. We could draw it on a napkin. It's not complicated. So is your question whether I support that, whether I would endorse that?
Yes, if you agree with that and if you endorse that.
I mean, I agree that that occurred, that offer was made. That's a matter of historical record. Do I support it? At the time, I was optimistic. I want to see peace. I want to see a handshake on the White House lawn. I want to see an end to this conflict and this bloodshed. I want to see the Palestinian state thriving and its people being productive and happy and prosperous. I want that. And I want the Israelis to be able to live in peace and not have to send their young men and women into harm's way, not have to live behind fences, not have to take on people like Hamas, the barbarians that they are. That's what I want. I want peace. And I think inevitably for there to be peace, there has to be compromise on both sides. I think in a compromise, neither side gets exactly what they want. So I think the Palestinians will have to accept perhaps less territory than they feel they're entitled to. And I think Israel will have to make some painful concessions as well and dismantle some settlements in the West Bank and perhaps give up some historic sites, which mean a lot to the Jewish people. But this is what's necessary in pursuit of something bigger and greater, which is peace.
All right. We do have another comment. When you speak about Hamas slaughter of Israeli civilians, what do you say about Israeli slaughters through Deir Yassin, Galil, Sabra and Shatila, and Gaza, and so on?
So we could go through those one by one. I don't think we gain too much in doing that, but I think there's a big difference between when we talk about the civilian casualties in Gaza now and the Israeli casualties from what happened 10 days ago, let's look at it. Let's not look at it purely by numbers, but the manner in which they were inflicted. So on the one hand, you had Hamas marauding through Israeli towns, schools, daycare centers, people's homes, with the aim of killing, torturing, terrorizing as many people as it possibly could. That's the objective. They killed 1,400 people. If they could have killed 14 million people, they would have. Now, Israel does what any normal country would do when faced with this terror, and it hits back. And it wants to hit Hamas hard. It wants to dismantle its leadership, and it wants to degrade its ability to perform terror attacks like this in future. I support that completely. It has to be done. Now, how does it do it? Does it carpet bomb Gaza? Of course not. If it did, then 2 million people would be dead in a matter of days, knowing Israeli firepower. No. It gives warnings. It says, we'll be striking this area. You have 24 hours to evacuate. Is that harsh on the civilian population? Of course it is. But war is harsh. And Hamas has brought us into this war. They carry out airstrikes. They drop leaflets first saying where they're going to strike and civilians should leave. They do whatever is necessary to minimize civilian casualties. Will civilians die? Of course they will. Partly because of the battle tactics of Hamas, partly because of the nature of war, which is imprecise, and partly because Gaza is a densely populated area. But you can't compare the intentional killing in close-up terms, in the most barbaric, graphic, and sadistic ways possible of as many people as possible, against that. Now, when we talk about the historic things, Sabra and Shatila, which was carried out by Christian forces in Lebanon, but of course Ariel Sharon was implicated for allowing them to go in. There's that. When we talk about Deir Yassin, of which there are different accounts, and you know, the prevailing accounts which I've read, and I know your viewers will probably disagree with the sentiment, is that it was a military operation, that there were civilian casualties, but nothing like the scale of what we've seen, and nothing with the intent of what we've seen. But I don't think there's much purpose in going back into historic grievances. I think when we're talking about the future and how to solve this conflict, we should look to the present and to the future. And when we try to draw an equivalence between Israel and Hamas, I don't think a reasonable person could make that argument. When they look at what Hamas does, what they believe, what they say, and what Israel does. Let's look at Israel for a moment. So Israel has had peace with Jordan since 1994. It's had peace with Egypt since 1979. Has Israel violated those countries in any way since that time? Has it tried to take their territory or attack its civilians or ethnically cleanse anyone? No. Israel wants to live in peace so it can build things, invent things, cure things. That's what it's there for. So when it's attacked, it's going to hit back. That's what it needs to do, and that's what it will do. But again, comparing it to a terrorist organization, I think is wholly beside the point.
All right. Well, thank you to the people who have left questions so far. If you would like to leave more, please feel free to do so in the comment section. We'll now move on to the next point. As I mentioned during my introduction a couple of days ago, I did have an interview with the Palestinian ambassador, and during that interview, he mentioned the fact that he thought the Israelis were becoming increasingly uninterested in the peace process. What do you say to that?
I think there's an element of truth to that. You know, for a long time, what we call the peace camp in Israel was ascendant, and there was a period of great hope and optimism. And that led to negotiations, and we've spoken about the offers that were made and the far-reaching offers which Israelis thought would be accepted. How could they not be accepted by any reasonable party that wants peace and statehood? And the fact that they were rejected, and the fact that they resulted usually in an escalation of violence on the Palestinian side, it made the Israeli public wholly jaded, and it made them believe that maybe the right is correct when they say that the Palestinians aren't interested in peace. And so since that time, you've had more and more voting for the right, and you've had more and more right-wing coalitions. And the view of the right is that there needs to be a managed conflict. That's what they talk about, a managed conflict. They believe that Israelis should not be in the lives of Palestinians. We have no desire to be there, and the Palestinians don't want them there. But they should be prevented from doing harm, which is why you have security barriers, why you have blockades, which were proven to be wholly ineffective, and so forth. So I think that it's true, the sentiment is true, that there's less appetite for peace, but I think it's because of the fact that the Israelis got burned when they believed in peace. So I think that's why we are where we are.
Okay. We do have another comment. Okay. All right. So obviously land is vital in this conflict. It is the reason for the conflict. Now, apparently Palestinians did compromise 78% of their historical Palestine to Israel in return for 22% of that said land. Now they see that their 22% dwindling. Now, if you put yourself in their shoes, what would your reaction be?
Well, I wouldn't be in those shoes because the premise is fundamentally flawed. It's incorrect. So what that's based on is a view that, again, the British mandate for Palestine, as though that's Arab Palestinian land, as though that's their state. And then there were calls for it to be partitioned in 37 and 47, which would have given the percentages that you gave there. So if you look at it that way and say there was an Arab Palestinian state, and then the state of Palestine that's formed out of it is only 22% or whatever it was, then that looks unjust. But that's not the truth. The truth is that this was held by the Ottoman Empire for 400 years. It was then decolonized of the Ottomans after they lost in World War One and lost their colonial spoils and gems, one of which was Palestine, which was considered a backwater at the time. You then had the British Mandate for Palestine, which included not only the land from the river to the sea, but also what was called East Palestine, became Transjordan, and now the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. That was included in that. Then in 1922, it was carved in two, and the right bank, the east bank of the Jordan River, that land became what is now Jordan, and the remaining land was envisaged to be a Jewish state. Then there was unrest. There was increasing Arab mobilization against the creation of a Jewish state. There were attempts to prevent Jewish migration and settlement. And then you had calls for further partition. And that's what you're referring to now. So a partition of that area between the river and the sea to create a Jewish state and an Arab state, roughly on the proportion of 55% being Arab and 45% being Jewish. So that's a more accurate prescription of things. You know, the view that it was all the Palestinians and then taken away from them and a little bit was offered back to them, it's just not true. It's just historically not true. And I'm willing to recognize the fact that when you have Arabs living in the land, as I said, who have no other land, what goes on in the treaty making of Europe doesn't really affect them and it doesn't really interest them. And they would view many things as being unjust. But that's what happens when you have post-World War and you have borders being redrawn and empires collapse and things happen. You have the creation of Arab states, which no one really complained about. No one now says that Syria and Lebanon and Saudi Arabia and Yemen are illegitimate, and Iraq, they're there and they should be there. And the Jewish state has every right to be there as well. So I think that part of the problem, you're getting really to the root of the conflict. You know, if one views it like that, as though this was an Arab state taken away by the greedy Jews with the help of colonial powers, you're not going to have peace. But if you approach it from the perspective of, as I said, two peoples with grievances and aspirations and pain that want to move forward, what is a fair way to achieve that? I believe through partition and a two-state solution, then maybe you can get somewhere.
Okay. I'd like to talk about rhetoric a little bit now. We're going to talk about rhetoric from the Israeli side as well as the Palestinian side. I will just like to start off with you quickly. In a recent Instagram post, you refer to the people holding the Israeli hostages as sadistic animals. Now, obviously, we know this violates, obviously, the hostage situation violates international law. But is there any perhaps concern on your half or on behalf of people who use this sort of language that could only serve to inflame the situation even further?
No, I don't accept that. I think that it's patently clear who I'm referring to and who I'm not referring to. I'm not referring to the average Arab with whom I feel a kinship and to whom I feel a great fondness. I'm not referring to the average Palestinian with whom I've met many times in my travels to the West Bank and with whom I have no ill feeling whatsoever. I'm referring to, as you read there, the people who are holding these hostages. And the people who are holding these hostages are Hamas. And Hamas has for many years orchestrated terror attacks against Israel, which was bad enough. But then in the last 10 days, they did what we all saw, which was to hack open the stomachs of pregnant women, which was to tie up parents and children, torturing one in front of the other before burning them all alive, rape women at a rave as the bodies of their friends were still warm beside them, and then haul off children, infants, babies, old women into captivity, where they're held now in God knows what circumstances. To me, these are the most savage animals imaginable. And I would even go further and say that animals don't behave like this. I don't know what this is, but it's inhuman. It's barbaric. And I think a distinction needs to be drawn between good and evil, right and wrong. And we have to be absolutely clear in our language. I don't want anyone to speak ill of Arab people or Palestinian people, and I wouldn't do that, and I wouldn't encourage anyone to do that. But I think we need to speak in the most explicit and harsh terms about what Hamas is. We can be under no illusions as to what they are.
You mentioned in your answer just now that when you traveled to the Gaza, you met ordinary Palestinians.
I've never been to. I've been to the
Not
West
to the
Bank.
Gaza, sorry, when you've been to Israel. So, okay, when you've been to Israel, pardon me, and you've met just average Palestinian people who have no connection to Hamas whatsoever, you had very, well, you've interacted with them. What were those interactions like? Pleasant, friendly?
Yeah, look, I've met a number of people, everyone from, I had an audience with the mayor of Ramallah, who struck me as a fairly decent guy. I met shopkeepers in Hebron, and also in a refugee camp near Bethlehem. I spoke to the people and I got along with them, like I felt like they were my cousins. The Jews are a people of the Middle East and the Palestinians are a people of the Middle East who have much in common. But in those conversations, they tended to follow the same sort of formula, where at the beginning they would say we want peace and peace and peace. And then the longer we would speak, they would start kind of going into conspiracy theories about the Jews doing this and the Jews doing that and the Jews controlling this and controlling that. So, but I kind of laughed that off, But as I said, I hold no ill will to the average Palestinian in Gaza or the West Bank or anywhere in the world who wants to live in peace and dignity and freedom. I think that's a basic human right. I have no ill will towards them. And as I've said numerous times, and I believe this wholly, they are the major victims of their own leadership, which is fundamentally, in my view, corrupt and inept and always puts conflict, some idealized conflict, ahead of the benefits and the rights of their own people. I think that's a great tragedy.
Mm-hmm. We have just gotten another comment from someone. What, to your knowledge, is being done regarding the Israeli hostages with Hamas? I suppose from a military point of view, I don't know what's intended. I imagine there will be every attempt made to rescue them. And I think what we're seeing now, again, I have no particular insight into Israeli military operations, but I believe they would be meticulously planning this. They would have intel, hopefully, on where these hostages are held and would be planning on how best to extract them, which I think would be extraordinarily difficult, knowing how Hamas operate, how they use their own civilians, how they'll use these civilians. So there's that, the military operation to get them back. In terms of diplomatic efforts, I think they're utterly futile. I mean, to go back into recent history when Hamas held Gilad Shalit, an Israeli soldier, he had no access to Red Cross visits. He had he wasn't kept in accordance with any standards of international law. So he was exposed to horrific conditions, and I think these hostages will be suffering even more, especially those who have no military training, those that are women and children and the elderly. I think they're in absolute horror minute by minute, and my heart is with them. Yes. No doubt there'll be calls from the international community and from Arab states for their release and liberation, but Hamas has no interest in that. They didn't take them to give them back. They took them to use as leverage. They took them to torture them, to terrorize psychologically both the hostages and the people of Israel and the Jewish world more widely. So I fear greatly for their fate. And I think that any efforts for their release, as noble as they are, I think that I'm skeptical about their likelihood of success. But I think it's important that all people, and this isn't merely a Jewish concern or an Israeli concern, we can call together for the creation of a Palestinian state, which is just and right and fair. But we can equally call for the release of these hostages immediately and unconditionally. I think it's a basic human duty to do that. Yes, well, God willing, all civilian hostages from both sides will be released.
I'm not aware of hostages on the other side. I mean, there are Palestinians held in Israeli jails, no doubt. But they're not plucked from their mother's arms. They're not shot and then dragged off into captivity. They're not paraded through the streets. They're subjected to due process and trial. Sometimes it's excessive and unjust. I recognize that. But again, there's no comparison between the two, in my view.
Oh, I agree there's no comparisons. Just from Palestinian friends who I've spoken to, they have heard stories of their friends or relatives who they felt had been jailed unjustly, but obviously perhaps it doesn't compare to what Israelis are going through with Hamas right now, but God willing, civilians on both sides will be kept safe. I will now talk about the Palestinian side. So how have yourself
We
and
have
perhaps
to
the Jewish community in Sydney...
inside.
No, I'm talking about... So we're talking about rhetoric.
Yeah.
When I say this, I mean, how have yourself and perhaps the Jewish community in Sydney felt since the beginning of Palestinian protests in Sydney, especially the ones we saw at the Opera House?
You know, they've really disappointed me greatly on many levels. Firstly, the fact that the protests began before any Israel military response. So the first protest took place just as news was coming out about the atrocities carried out by Hamas. So what were these people protesting exactly? In my view, they weren't protesting, they were supporting, they were relishing the fact that Hamas had unleashed these atrocities on Israeli civilians. And I think that that's an inhuman reaction. The protests that have ensued, I'm sure that there's a mix of people there. In some cases, there's thousands of people there. And I'm sure some people want peace and believe in a two-state solution and merely want to see an end to war and an end to conflict. And I'm with them. I would march with them if that's what they believe. But I think that a lot of them don't support that. I think they want war as long as it's inflicted on Israel, not by Israel. I think they want to see the destruction of Israel. And I think that they're immense hypocrites. I think they frame themselves as being about peace and justice and human rights. I don't think they care about that at all. And then we saw some subsects, and again, I recognize this wasn't the majority, but it wasn't one or two people either. It was probably about 100 people chanting F the Jews and gas the Jews, which I think is an insight into this as well. You know, when people fly the flag of Palestinian liberation, some people have positive and noble motives, but a lot of people, for them, it's about supremacy and hatred and anti-Semitism.
Okay. We did just get a question, but it's very similar to the one I just asked now. It was, what's your reaction to the local protests in Sydney since the massacre last week? Obviously, we will probably skip that question since you just answered it. So we will move on to the next point. We've just covered the rhetoric of both sides. I will want to ask you now, you've condemned the Australian Greens for their stance in this war. Are you worried that the Greens, who have a young following of youths, might influence the next generation's thinking regarding to the Middle East crisis?
You know, from a kind of strategy point of view, what you've said might be valid, but I think that times like this, times of crisis, is a time for clarity and straight talk. And those who have had the integrity to speak out against the terrorism without attempting to, obfuscate or draw false equivalences, we've commended them, no matter what side of politics they're on. Independent, I was going to say Green, but there have been no Greens, Labour, Liberal, and those who can't bring themselves to condemn a heinous terrorist attack against civilians without saying "but" at the end of it, I have no time for, frankly, and I will condemn them. And so the Greens, to me, who hold themselves out as these bastions of human rights, I think they're immensely hypocritical. I don't think they care about human rights. I think they care about certain human rights that fit into their political agenda and their radical leftist ideology. And that's it. And look, and we'll call it out and we'll continue to do so. But I think that they're an outlier. I think they're a minority. I think the vast majority of Australians, just as the vast majority of the Australian Parliament, look at those scenes and think whatever the rights and wrongs of the conflict and of the last 75 and 100 years, nothing justifies that. And most people have no hesitation in condemning that, absolutely, without putting a big but at the end of it.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, what I'm about to ask Mr. Ryvchin is the last question I have. So if you do have any questions you would like to ask, please feel free to do so in the comment section before we go offline. Mr. Ryvchin from Sydney, Australia, what do you say to the Jewish community living here and who are currently fighting in Israel?
To the Jewish community that are what, sorry?
Living here and currently fighting in the Gaza.
You mean Australians fighting in Gaza?
No, as in, like, what do you say to Jews here as they obviously need to worry about what's happening over there, perhaps with their loved ones, and perhaps to any Israeli soldiers who may be watching this, who can get a message of support from you?
Look, in terms of their mission of eradicating Hamas, I wish them well. I want to see no suffering by civilians. I hope that the Palestinian people in Gaza, the men, women, the children, the civilians who want no part of war, I hope that their suffering is brief, and I hope it ends quickly. And I really hope they're liberated from Hamas and Islamic Jihad. For the people of Israel and the Jewish community, and for all peoples, really, all people here in Australia, Arabs, Jews, Christians, Muslims, whatever, I hope we can have peace. We all live here in Australia in a tremendous society. We're the luckiest people on earth to live here. And I think that whatever our differences based on religion or tribalism or construction of history, I think there's room to talk. And I've often reached out to Palestinians with whom I've debated, for the enjoyment of others. But, I don't want to do that. I want to sit with people and have dialogue and talk and find common ground. And I believe that's possible. So I hope that we can have peace there, and I can hope that we continue to have peaceful relations here.
All right. Well, Mr. Ryvchin, I'm just going to check to see if you have any more questions. No, it looks like we should be fine. All right, Mr. Ryvchin, on behalf of the Oz Arab Media team, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. I'd like to thank our viewers, especially those who asked questions. Obviously, this is a very difficult, to say the least, situation, not just for the Israelis and the Palestinians, but for all the people of the world. So I hope we can all pray together for a peaceful outcome. Once again, Mr. Ryvchin, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for your great questions, and for those who listened and watched and wrote in, thank you so much. It's lovely to chat.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Take care.